Many African countries sit on vast oil reserves like Libya, Nigeria, and Angola, but whether the continent has truly capitalized on its most valuable commodity remains a subject of intense debate. Historically, the oil landscape was defined by exporting oil overseas. Though recently, this dynamic has shifted with game-changing refineries across Africa being created and the US-Iran war sparking more concerns about absolute sovereignty. Today, we sit with three experts on the oil landscape in Africa. Gospel Obele is head of Streetonomics. As an economist, he has supported businesses, institutions, and more to position them for growth, as well as being a commentator across 40 markets in Europe, Africa, and beyond. Oluropo Olugbemi is an M&A commercial person at Afentra. With an investment banking background, he focuses on acquiring sites and near-field development assets, with his core portfolio of Afentra being located in West Africa, as well as being involved in contract negotiations. And finally, Musa Obed is the founder of SysIn Africa, the African Economic Intelligence Platform. He's advised investment, cross-border payments, and client action for various different stakeholders in Africa and more. Hello, and welcome to the Afribond Roundtable. Now, before we start, as always, I'll just quickly explain the format. I'll be asking the panel 4 different questions, this time relating to oil in Africa, and the panel will have around 12 minutes to give their thoughts and discussion. Then we'll pass on to our virtual guest, Musa, who will give his thoughts and his feedback on the discussion so far. So without further ado, let's get started. Our first question is, how has the Dangote Refinery changed the oil landscape in Nigeria and Africa? So with the Dangote Refinery, it was commissioned a couple years ago, and we've seen quite a bit of volatility in terms of prices and also a change in some of the products that have been made in imports and exports. But I'd love to get your thoughts on how this has really impacted Nigeria in terms of oil prices, in terms of how things have moved in terms of exports and imports and more. So Gospel, happy to start with yourself.
Well, fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think it was really, really important for the refinery, Dangote Refinery, to have started. Taking a cue back, to a couple of years now, we all know about the Nigerian refinery situation. We've got refineries in many parts of the country, a few parts of the country rather, but none of these refineries over the period of time have been working, and the conditions around privatizing some of the refineries as well. Mind you still have some oil-related activities happening that might not be seen as legal of some sort. It's just that those activities don't happen via the conventional refinery. So the refineries have stopped working for a long time, and Nigeria has had very interesting conditions around the oil sector generally, being the fact that it also it makes about over 75% of our foreign exchange earnings, and a huge part of our external reserves as well, and many of the budgetary allocations and the planning and all that have been set based off on the oil sector. However, the Nigerian economy is also very diversified away from oil, is what's setting that context from the get-go. But I think Dangote saw the opportunity there, and he made a move to become the first Nigerian to sort of have that privatization approach to how refineries can be set up, and how they can work to sort of also reduce the demand of imported refined fuel and the likes to meet local demand. However, that has not significantly also reduced prices. Demand hasn't dropped. I personally think that the context around the demand for fossil fuel products, or fuel in this context from Nigerians, is also hinged on the fact that we have a really weakening power sector. If 50 to 70% of our power challenges in Nigeria were fixed, I don't think that we'll be faced with the kind of demand that we have locally in Nigeria. So just what's setting all that first of all, but I would also love to hear more from my colleague.
Thank you for having me, and you shared a lot of really good insights about the history of the Dangote Refinery and how we really needed the refinery to come on board. I think the capacity that the refinery is coming with is something very noteworthy. I think the goal at the moment is a 650,000 barrel capacity refinery, with the goal to expand to about 1.4 million barrels per day in 3 years. I think that's the goal that Dangote has set, and that significantly plays a role in the in the region in general, but of course more particularly in Nigeria, given that, I mean, growing up, everything that we always talked about was the fact that we exported the oil to get refined, and it got brought back into the country, and that was expensive. But now you have a player that has come on board and has said, why don't we do it in the country? Of course, we had refineries before Dangote came on board. Notably, we had the Warri Refinery, the Kaduna Refinery, and the Port Harcourt Refinery, but none of them have been properly been in operation for quite a while, especially the Kaduna Refinery that hasn't produced in the last decade. This one touches me quite personally because I used to live in Kaduna, and so it's quite sad that we had those facilities that didn't quite live up to expectation. But I think Dangote Refinery coming on board has brought some light into that sector.
Fascinating, and it's become one of the biggest refineries in the world. Like you said, 650k barrels of oil being processed into refined products, which is very a big task. I wanted to ask though, because you talked about the fact that Nigeria exports quite a bit of crude oil, but when it comes to before the Dangote refinery, they imported quite a lot of those refined products, the fuel, the aviation, plastic products too. So now it's been a couple of years, I'm assuming we've seen quite a lot of exported products now from Nigeria being refined products. Is that what has taken into place and come into fruition?
Should I kick
Yeah,
off?
of course.
I think not even to talk about like a lot of data, I'll just talk about May 2026, which was a month ago. Dangote was announced to be the highest exporter of jet fuel in the whole region. And that was that is testament to the fact that the refinery is quite useful to the region. And we are moving from being a net importer to being a net exporter. But it's not just to the world, but also to the other African countries. We keep talking about the fact that the growth of Africa is hinged on the need for energy. And so being a net exporter means that we have enough to cater for our own needs and have surplus to send out. And I think jet fuel is one to really talk about because, we live in the global economy now. You might need to fly out tomorrow, and then, with the wars happening, people were already talking about airlines running out of fuel in a few months, but Africa coming on board and being able to produce and also being able to export, I think really changes the landscape for a lot of things.
Definitely. And could I ask, Gospel, I'll hand it to you. So obviously when we were importing a lot of those refined products, particular fuel, much of it was from Western countries and also India, Netherlands, India. We would import tons and tons of fuel. And now Nigeria is exporting these products and they no longer need a lot of these imported products. How was there maybe a pricing war? Was this challenged by maybe counterparts that lost a huge amount of revenue as a result of the Dangote Refinery coming into place and producing more of these products?
Well, I mean, you expect some market kickbacks from the dynamics of how this has played out. An economy that used to import lots of refined products suddenly now has a major player who's exporting those refined products. So you already have players who are bringing in those refined products. They want to, keep at the game. They want to have their product still coming, at a particular price set and all of that. So there is competition, even with Dangote, there's competition. Though the big question would then be that, are there any incentives to encourage more of that Dangote, private-led refinery model locally in Nigeria, and how those incentives work to ensure that, there is more control around the value chain locally, whether or not it's just Dangote, just having more players at that level who can. And it's okay, it's likely going to be an oligopolistic market because it's not a market any kind of person can just go into, so you probably have 2, 3, 4 top players who might be doing that level of refining locally, just like Dangote has done. So I think there has to be some more strategic incentives to pull people away from just bringing in imported refined products to join or emulate, in quote, that private sector-led model. And there are individuals who have the wherewithal to put that off locally, and also to say that also don't want to run the risk of too much dependence on a single private sector-led model, which is good for the local economy, but you need a minimum level of about 2, 3, 4 players leading the pack in that space to ensure that there is full-on sort of maximizing the market value from what we have the potential to, and also looking at even the Warri, Port Harcourt, and Kaduna refinery. What does that look like in terms of probably privatizing them, or finding other models that could work to get more private sector players involved? And don't forget, like I mentioned earlier, there is still some form of refining ongoing. It's just that it's not happening in the conventional routes that people expect to happen. So and I talked about this a few times. How do you incentivize people, from that informal space of refining to a more formal space, if you get what I mean, and how do you encourage more local players to get more formally engaged in the refining of oil and all of that? So a lot of refining still happens locally. Yeah. It's just that it's not formal, and all that. So I think Nigeria has what it takes to get its market dynamics right, and to encourage that collaborative, in quote, model towards privatization and making the most of what the gains could be for the region.
Sure, no, and it's a part that commentators have mentioned, just the power that the refinery and Aliko has at the moment. So like you said, privatization and that competition could be key in the future. We're just coming up to the time now. So Musa, I'll just pass it on to you. So I know we've done a few pieces on the Dangote Refinery, and we've talked about it one-on-one in terms of the impact that it's had last year. So it'll be very interesting to get your thoughts so far on how it's changed the oil landscape in Nigeria and in Africa.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I think, as my colleagues has already mentioned, and just with what Gospel has just mentioned, right? The Dangote Refinery, more than anything, I think, is just giving a lot of people like the confidence required when it comes to industrialization, especially at scale. The changing landscape is just really just tied to the viewpoint that for 50 years, local refineries in Warri, local refineries around the country, run by NNPC, gave reasons why it could not work. But with, the planning started from 2013, but then by 2024, of course, Dangote comes in and shows that, okay, like we can actually refine. And as at this year, I think for PMS, that's petrol, premium motor spirit, he supplies 62% of Nigeria's petrol. And if you take this into context, right, into what is happening in the world today, which I know we'll get to like later in the next questions. Without the Dangote refinery, I think a lot of Nigerians and the country as a whole will have been in bigger exposure, will have experienced more risks. And will have basically seen a net impact that will have been very unsustainable for household incomes and also for government stability. So more than anything, I think it's the perception of what he has done, just not to repeat the points that have already been mentioned, but the perception of what Dangote has done, the belief and the capacity to tell people that, like this can be done in a country like Nigeria. And more than that, like more than just 600,000 barrels, we can do way more and do 1.4 million barrels within the next couple of years.
Liking this video so far, please take a moment to give us a like, hype, and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so you never miss an update from us. For more deep dives and one-on-one interviews, you can listen to our podcast, Afribond Sessions, either here on YouTube or on Spotify. On the Afribond Sessions, we speak with leaders and key stakeholders across Africa and the African diaspora to explore the business, the ideas, and trends shaping the continent. You can also visit our website to learn more about the work we do at Afribond and our upcoming events. But for now, back to the show. And our second question is, why has the Dangote Refinery reduced fuel prices across Nigeria? So we've seen with the Dangote Refinery, we mentioned in the first question that was commissioned a couple of years ago, we've seen the change in importing refined products to exporting many refined products. But pricing in terms of one of the bigger refined products, fuel, has been very volatile. We've seen even just after the subsidy was removed and the Dangote Refinery was put in, prices shot up, and it's even gone past the 1,000 naira mark, especially in this year after the conflict. So I'm very interested to see your thoughts on where we see maybe prices going and the reasons for why the prices shot up so much in recent times. So Oluropo, happy to start with yourself.
I think when you talk about it now, it sounds even scarier, because I do remember when fuel prices were 165 naira per liter. Hearing it at over 1,000 naira is definitely bad. But I think in my head there are four areas that really contribute to that, and one of those areas is the removal of subsidies, and that has very long history with different formats being tested: partial subsidies, full subsidy removals, and where we're at now. But that's one area in my head. And the second area will be the devaluation of the naira, and just over time the naira has weakened. One, because we were net importer, and that has put a lot of pressure on the naira. But again, another big area that we may delve into and not delve into, but the third area will be the naira to crude deal that sort of went sideways. I think that also really affected prices. And the fourth area, which I think is something we'll discuss later, is really around the macroeconomics of today's world, with the US-Iran wars happening and supply shortages. But if I was to just zoom into one of those areas and let Gospel and Musa give us a bit more wisdom, I think if we talked about the subsidy removals very briefly, that started off a couple of years ago with tests to do a partial subsidy, because it was costing the government a significant amount of money to subsidize crude. And I'm guessing most of the people that will be watching this know why that has happened. But for those that are not aware, because we exported the raw materials and then imported the refined crude, it was very expensive. And for the average day-to-day user to not feel that full effect, the government has had to put subsidies in place. And this, over time, has costed the government so much money. Well, the arguments that say, well, it's taxpayer money, and of course, that's what the government is meant to be meant to do. They're meant to subsidize things here and there. But I think long term, the government didn't think that was sustainable, and thought that we needed to start drawing away from that, partially or fully. It's a very controversial topic, but that's one of the realities that has led us to where we are today. And then when you go into sort of the weakening of the naira, and unfortunately that has been the reality for Nigeria for quite some time. And I see Gospel nodding from my side eye, so I'll slide this one to him to talk about it a bit more, and on sort of the other areas as well that have affected prices.
Yeah, I mean, really, really brilliant submissions, I must say. Very, very brilliant submissions. And the four reasons I had mentioned were very, central to why we are here today, in terms of the conversations around the oil price to start with. I think since 2020, the world changed significantly. And in 2014, Nigeria had a recession, and just within a space of 6 years, in 2020, we had a twin recession. I mean, where you had both the oil price, and the COVID, the lockdown impact on economic activities and all that. So, and since 2020, the world has never been the same. We've got the Russia-Ukraine war, still dealing with the post COVID impact on the global economy, the rise of the Trump 2.0, and more recently the US-Iran war and all that. So that has significantly impacted on major oil blocks in the world. How production, distribution, and supply chain economics has also, the impact of the geopolitical tensions as well on oil. And he rightfully mentioned about the subsidy conversation. But if you take a step backward, I think one of the major reasons why it's been a lot of poor economics for Nigerians is because we're talking about subsidy to start with, because if you walk backwards a bit, you realize that there is a significant demand on fuel in Nigeria. And if you look at it very well, the livelihood or the average lifestyle of the average Nigerian is literally roped around fuel. People need fuel to survive, to run their homes, to keep the lights on. The MSME, the informal sector MSME on the road needs a Tiger generator to power their barbering shop. So the economy itself runs individuals, households, firms, and that's because there's a significant demand. So I said earlier on, if we probably fix power by 50 to 65%, not even at 100%, 50 to 65%, there's going to be a significant drop in the demand for oil to start with, because our households consume up to about 30 liters on the average of fuel every week. That's a lot of individual household demand on fuel. So if you look at that rising demand and the supply economics hasn't been really, really stable over a period of time, it's just simple law of economics, the prices will always keep going up. Then in the context of that, you now have a weakening Naira currency. The Naira has, been at the mercy of political economics and many other reasons over a period of years now. It's been poorly managed, and I always say that the currency of every nation is hinged on the productivity drivers of that economy. How productive your economy is would reflect in the strength of your currency, and also safe to say how effective institutional frameworks are when it comes to regional engagement and all that. So on those two grounds, we've not really done well from a Nigerian governance context, and that has impacted on the quality of the Naira and all of that. So let's also take away the fact that, with Dangote, he's also faced with lots of individuals and institutions who are still importing oil and who would have to import oil at the global market price as well. Do not forget that by the time these things are refined in Netherlands, Europe, and all those spaces, they sell them back to us at global market prices, and we import. When we import, the economics of that importation as well also has its cost, and that cost will be translated to the final consumers. Do not forget also that businesses who also run locally and have to import semi-finished items or finished products and all that also import them at the cost of global logistic transportation price, which is heavily again hinged on oil and all of that. So it's ripple effect cost on the local economy, which I think would be a major thing to deal with as we move on in the near future.
Fantastic. No, there was a few points that you made, especially fascinating, the devaluation of the currency and just the amount of fuel that the everyday citizens use relative to other people that have maybe more stringent or effective power markets. I just want to touch on the subsidy removal again, because you did mention the partial removal of the subsidy rather than maybe the cold turkey that we've done in the last couple of years. So obviously the World Bank, IMF, they're not maybe favorites of Nigeria and various African nations, but there was a few organizations that mentioned maybe doing a partial subsidy removal rather than completely removing the subsidy and the aftermath. Why maybe was that not the case in terms of partial subsidy and being in place, or reducing the subsidy that we had already? I know you mentioned the fiscal constraint, but it'd be very good to get into that more.
I'm trying not to trend on the internet for the wrong reasons. But I think the country tried in the first place. I think, as you said, before we got to the sort of cold turkey situation now, the country tried to do a partial subsidies thing before, and it didn't quite work out because I think a lot of economics had the view that it wasn't sustainable long term for the country to keep on subsidizing. But as you say, like, different organizations have given their thoughts as to whether they thought we could continue subsidizing for a longer term. I think it also comes from the fact that if we subsidized oil, and oil was not necessarily then a strong revenue driver because we were importing expensive oil, it then begged the question, so what were you going to use to fund the gap, right? Because if funding is from the government coffers, but then what is actually replacing all of that that deficit? So I think it was just a tricky one. I'm trying not to to be on one side, but just give perspective as to what has happened and why things were done. But we have an economist in our midst that will throw out some numbers. I'm sure Musa is also dying to tell us something more.
And could I mention maybe as a last question, and I'll leave it to Gospel and then pass to Musa. So we haven't actually mentioned the US and Iran conflict in deeper detail yet, and we'll definitely be talking about it in the third question. Let's say, hypothetically, the US and Iran conflict doesn't arise. Do you think the fuel prices would be at that steady level or target that maybe the government wanted? Because last year there was an increase in fuel prices at the start, but we did see fuel prices dropping slightly. And of course the conflict wiped out all of that. So how big of an impact was that US-Iran conflict on the fuel prices just in Nigeria?
I think, do you want me to speak to the subsidy first?
Yes, please go on.
So I think to start with, the subsidy situation wasn't so sustainable for Nigeria any longer because, we had borrowing money to run the economy. It was really bad. We're in a very, very bad debt situation. Almost about 70 to 90% of the revenue was being used to service debt, at the time, and it was really, really, really bad. However, I think when it was completely removed, in quotes, in 2023, I think, when an announcement was made, it was slightly abrupt. I think the approach and the timing wasn't really human-centered, in quotes. And also, again, speaking to human-centered, like I mentioned before, the drivers of the Nigerian economy strongly reliant on down to the individual. And I think that fundamental model itself is counterproductive to whatever is being done to fix the oil situation in Nigeria. And if you take it again from that context, you also realize that Nigeria is a very complex market, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach technically to many of its challenges. So there are a lot of trade-off complexities when you're thinking about how policies work and all that. However, I think the announcement was quite abrupt and all that. With the Russia-Ukraine, with the US-Iran war, I think if that war hadn't happened, I wouldn't say for sure that oil prices would have really stable, because don't forget, we're still coming from the Russia and Ukraine war. There's a Trump 2.0 commissions on tariffs and all the like. So there was still, the geopolitical tensions were already hitting. So maybe the prices wouldn't have gone as high as it is now. Probably would have moderated for a bit and probably increased over a period of time. But I think the tensions were already there. The US-Iran war just took it out of
Sure. No, interesting here. And it'll be great, Musa, to get your thoughts too. Obviously, I'll take Ropo's kind of 4 pillars as to why fuel prices have been impacted in Nigeria. But I'd love to get your thoughts. I know you've got a bit to say about how much Nigeria has been importing in terms of crude oil, but how that affects fuel prices in Nigeria too.
Okay. I'm just going to start from where Gospel stops. I think the irony of the Iran-US crisis is that Nigeria actually profits from war, unfortunately, right? So when we think about it, it's like anytime there's, these geopolitical tensions, all markets react. What it means for the Nigerian government is that the revenue is going to increase. But of course, then comes like the reality of the complexity that was already mentioned, which is when all prices go up, globally, government benefits, but then it results to inflation. So if you actually check the inflation numbers in Nigeria, Nigeria's inflation has actually been reducing for 11 months up until, I think, March or April or May this year, and it increased back again. The inflation, I think, now is close to like 16%. And it was the first time in 11 months that it increased. So government benefits from a revenue standpoint, citizens are losing. And I think when we now take the broader perspective of 2023, when the subsidy was removed by President Tinubu, right? I think, first of all, I believe that Nigeria could not live in a subsidy reality anymore. I believe that it was the right decision, but I think that the issue was the planning, was the thoroughness about, okay, what do we do if we actually remove subsidies? How does that impact people? because from a Nigerian perspective, there's a fundamental problem of household income, right? When we say fuel prices are expensive or fuel prices are not increasing, it's related to the fact that for the average Nigerian person that has a car or is trying to buy gas, etc., those prices are expensive from their own pockets. If we put it in context to the global price markets, like Nigeria is below average. That is the Nigeria prices, like petrol prices, I think are like $0.88 per liter, whereas the global average is somewhere about like $1.32 per liter, right? So from a global standpoint, we are lower, but of course, for the Nigerian, I think it was, I don't know who mentioned it, but like the whole issue and conversation about productivity, if you don't have a population that's able to increase their wage, increase, the capacity of their wages, how much they're getting, you are not really going to see the material benefits of having a Dangote in the individual lives.
And our third question is, how has the US and Iran conflict impacted African nations regarding oil? So obviously we know it's one of the biggest topics in the world right now, the conflict and the war that's still going on between US and Iran. It's impacted the Middle East, but it's definitely impacted Africa as a whole, whether it's regarding oil, whether it's regarding shipping. So very interested to get your thoughts on some of the countries that are being impacted and again, what we see happening in the future. Gospel, happy to start with yourself.
Okay. Fantastic. It's a major, event that has really, shaped trade relations, particularly. I think it mostly takes off from there, and the context around allyship as well. Which countries are on the U.S. side, which countries are on the Iran, and all of that. And before this even happened, from the days of the trade tariffs and all that, we've been seeing countries, evolve in their trade relationships in terms of who they're now building allies with and partnerships and all of those stuff. Partnerships you would not easily think of. We saw the conversations coming up and all of that, and we saw the speech given by Mark Carney at the World Economic Forum in January. So clearly the geopolitical landscape has significantly changed, and it's impacting on the trade relations with Africa. And unfortunately, I think Africa hasn't done well with engaging the rest of the world in terms of its own interest when it comes to trade as well. So the consumption of oil is such that, there are a couple of African nations that have a very good deposit of oil, Nigeria, Congo, and a few of them and all that. And at the end of the day, in the context of what Trump represents as well, these nations are nations that would be front burner conversations as we go on, in context of how this war has also evolved. So I see lots of trade tensions also come into play. However, I think it will be mostly required from African nations to begin to set the tone as per what they really want in the larger scheme of things, particularly how the world evolves post this war and what that looks like for the oil and gas sector, but also in context to the future of renewables, clean energy, and how the energy transition conversation is also ongoing. The EU is very big on that. I don't think they are going to be shifting courses when it comes to their position on climate change and energy transition and all that. So, and I think it will be important for African nations to begin to also get into that side of conversations as well, because I don't think the oil context is really sustainable for Africa. I think that there are still many rural areas that are, that lack electricity and basic energy and all of that. And it's part of the reasons why we're talking about subsidy as well. There's just a huge demand for energy in Africa. And I don't think the oil economics at the moment, by being the fact that it's intersecting firmly with trade relations and geopolitical tensions, would in any way provide some form of clarity in terms of how we're enabling energy transition and also inclusion for the last mile.
No, you're right, especially we've talked about the renewable energy space quite a few times on Afribond and how to grow this in Africa. But at the same time, like you said, the geopolitical tensions are having a massive impact with regards to trade, and many of the products that we trade are oil. So Robbo, as an oil analyst, be fascinated to get your thoughts there in terms of how things are changing in terms of trade and oil.
Yeah, I think it's the US-Iran trade war, or rather war, opened up a lot of different things. One, it opened up the fact that improving production in Africa or refining in Africa is more important now than ever. Because the moment the Strait of Hormuz was closed and everybody started scrambling for oil, then the question then came, so where else can we then get oil, right? And then it brought a lot of spotlight to the Dangote Refinery, but beyond Nigeria and stepping into the broader Africa, you have refineries in Cabinda and Angola that are coming on stream as well, that very useful to the general production refinery picture. And you also have Namibia, who has recently discovered some oil, and a lot of investment is going that way, really helping to shape this. So in touching Musa's point slightly, when conflict happens, the government benefits from it, but not necessarily the people, right? And being part of an upstream producer, I know that it was great for prices to go up. That helped the revenue line, but it wasn't quite useful for the everyday consumer. But again, what has the war done for Africa? To put a spotlight on Africa, that there's a great opportunity to be part of this production picture and providing energy to the world. But the second part of it, which we were slightly talking about, is the clean energy thing. Post the deal, right, the peace deal, well, certain things have happened in the last few days that have put a question mark in whether there's really a deal on the table or not.
Every week,
it changes every hour at this point. But one of the things that didn't support prices to still stay up is the fact that the demand from China didn't quite go back to the pre-war levels. And it's first of all storage. China has always tried to be an independent state, and of course they prepare for things way ahead of the world does prepare for things. But I think they're further advanced in this clean energy journey, right? I haven't been to China myself, but a lot of people that have talk about how, maybe it's exaggerating, but 60% of the fleet on the road is EVs, right? And they're trying to stay away from the dependency on oil and trying to really go ahead on this clean energy journey. So them being a lot of the demand for oil came from China. So if you cut that out of the way, that also affects its demand and supply and prices, right? But yeah, I think that's another interesting insights that came from the war, that, well, oil and gas is still very relevant. Africa needs to play that part, but also we need to be thinking about what happens in the post-oil world, and the cleaner energy world. And also, we shouldn't focus too much on just the oil and gas, but also start thinking about the renewable energy. And so we need to play in that aspect as well. So sure. I think the war has been very insightful, and it keeps our lives interesting.
Right. No, and what you mentioned about China is so true. They are definitely one of the biggest polluters in the world, but they're also one of the biggest producers of renewable energy too.
Yeah.
So there's always that catch-22, similar to US and a lot of bigger nations. So maybe it is key for Africa to improve on that. Maybe bringing it back, because we've said it's been insightful in terms of how the conflict has changed and opened people's eyes. Would we say, especially with Dangote refineries and discoveries of new oil in countries like you mentioned, did that cushion the fall in terms of how volatile prices could have been, even though we've seen fuel price and other prices like aviation fuel rise? But would you say refineries that have been created recently in Africa have really cushioned the fall? Or would there still been a significant impact otherwise?
I'll let Gospel go a deeper dive into this, but I'll crack a dad joke, for lack of a better word. When you think about a cushion, that it could be a soft cushion or a hard one, and I say this to try to explain that it did help. I think it did help, but by how much? There's a constraint on capacity, right, in Africa. So even though I think personally that the refinery, the Dangote Refinery and the new discoveries in Africa helped in this war. I don't think it had enough of a cushioning effect. That is my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree because the bit around cushioning effect is something that Africa hasn't done well with when it comes to global shocks, and how those shocks penetrate prices, consumer spending, and all the likes. So we haven't done that well. Probably more or less a governance issue, and also an infrastructure issue as well. How are we preparing for many of these shocks as they come along? And you'd be surprised to know that many of these oil producers, locally within Africa, there's also debates around how much of coordination, how much of mission-centric, approach is being taken when it comes to cushioning the impact of externalities on the local continent. So I don't think there is that level of strong coordination yet, because again, it's an intersection of policy, politics, and geopolitical interest as well. Many of the things we see are just outcomes of geopolitical interest and tensions as it moves across supply chains and all that stuff. So I think the issue of cushioning impact and all that is beyond just the private sector player. It's got a lot to do with the governance, got a lot to do with policy, it's got a lot to do with the continent as a whole and how it's powering its approach towards engaging with other regions of the world, and also geopolitical interest.
Now, you mentioned that coordination and maybe partnerships and deals like the African Free Trade Continental Area might have a real help and support when that comes into more fruition in recent years. Well, just finishing up, I'll just ask one last question. Then, it's just when we see some of these countries that obviously export a lot of crude oil and refined products across Africa, so the Angolas, the Nigerias, right now. So we've seen obviously there's been that big shock, and as a result, their revenues in terms of oil, in terms of refined products, increase. A lot of the times, though, this isn't a long-term increase. It's just due to that economic shock. And then revenues can go back to the norm. So would you say that governments are prepared for this, just in case, for example, the conflict ends and then fuel prices maybe return to relative normal in terms of the world and in terms of oil? Or is there more in terms of basically making sure that they're ready for the setback if this continues? So happy to pass that on to you.
Okay, yes. I think for Nigeria and many other parts of Africa, there's also a case of fiscal indiscipline, and it's slightly more around fiscal indiscipline, and probably China would say infrastructure, technically. What that simply means is when the times are good, you're expected to have, the net difference between what you've pegged the oil price to be and what it is today. You probably have to put that in your reserve or something else and all that, and ensure that those reserve monies are what you then use in the rainy days. But what happened, for instance, in the case of Nigeria is, there's a lot of fiscal indiscipline within the space. And then when the rainy days came, lots of the states were asking for bailouts. You get so it's a fiscal indiscipline problem, number one, and also not creating the soft infrastructure required, to ensure that we're planning for the rainy days. So yeah.
Thank you, Gospel. Musa, let me just pass it on to you. So we've talked about the US-Iran conflict and geopolitical tensions in general. Love to get your take on the impact that's happened across African nations so far.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to continue from like fiscal indiscipline because it's a serious issue. I don't know if you guys saw, but I think each year there's like a 2 billion. So all the other refineries, like in Nigeria in this case, there's like a $2 billion that's used to like maintain these refineries. And of course, when they ask if like what are you maintaining a refinery that's not functional, right? So there's a lot of that fiscal indiscipline that I think is problematic. But then like sometimes I just sit down and I ask myself, right? Well, if we consider first of all the makeup of the economy, and how being a private business versus being a government has very different incentives. What I mean is, as government, right? These are elected officials, right? And they don't have the same incentives than the Dangote will have. And I think it sounds a bit qualitative, not necessarily something you can quantify. But I think like that is so important, especially when we look at it from the wider African conversation, right? Last month we had an event in Barcelona, and there was a South African that came to me, and we are just talking about, just the economy of the two countries, and he was like, he just wishes that South Africa have a Dangote. And what he was trying to say with that is that he just feels that there's somebody so rich or that has so much resources, but that also has the willingness to put matters of national interest or infrastructure interest, right, ahead of just like profits. And I think for Africa generally, what the war has shown us is that, first of all, energy security, oil sovereignty are very, very important. Even though, as was mentioned, the cushion that the Dangote Refinery right now did not necessarily solve all our problems. But I think what it did was to show other African countries. Like I can remember reading like a piece of the Kenyan president talking about how, making reference to Dangote's refinery. Also, when Dangote, now he's trying to build a refinery in Eastern Africa, I think it's in Kenya, not Tanzania. But it's just showing everyone that if you have a Dangote or a representative or something that is like a Dangote, some of your problems will be solved. But I think enabling that is something that government has to do with the private space. I don't think government has the capacity or the willingness to do it because they just don't have the incentives that a private person will have.
Liking this video so far, please take a moment to give us a like, hype, and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so you never miss an update from us. For more deep dives and one-on-one interviews, you can listen to our podcast, The Afribond Sessions, either here on YouTube or on Spotify. On the Afribond Sessions, we speak with leaders and key stakeholders across Africa and the African diaspora to explore the business, the ideas, and trends shaping the continent. You can also visit our website to learn more about the work we do at Afribond and our upcoming events. But for now, back to the show. Our fourth question is, what are the major projects in oil shaping Africa and the trend shaping Africa? So obviously we've talked about a few of the different topics and news stories that have really shaped the continent as a whole, and also some of the projects too, but be interesting just to delve into this a bit more and get your take first for Oluropo, but we can start with you with some of those projects and trends that are really making an impact so far.
I think we'll first kick off by saying that the African Energy Chamber actually forecasts that there will be about a $40 to $50 billion capex spend annually in Africa between 2026 to 2030, and that is a significant amount of money by any standard. But where does that money come from? I think that's now I'll talk about where the money comes from, and then some of the projects that I see coming on stream, and the sort of conditions attached to this money. So a lot of that money is coming from private capital. I think that's quite interesting and touches on one of the last points that Musa made, that the governments they don't have enough capacity to be able to pull off that kind of investment, right? And I was still a phrase from Gospel's books is patient capital, right? I think in the past, growing up, every time you thought about a project that required someone to be patient and not require return very soon, that was government. But recently, that hasn't necessarily been the case. It's seen like in Africa, privatization has really been one of the greatest catalysts for growth, right? And we I try not to talk about Dangote anymore. Otherwise, this becomes a Dangote promo.
It's a major
he is a major player, but I think the refinery that I was talking about in the Cabinda region in Angola is majorly funded by GemCorp, which is a UK-based emerging market fund, and that's one out of the lots that is really majorly funded by private capital, right? You have projects in Namibia that are coming on stream in the next couple of years that people should be watching out for. The Orange region or the Orange Basin, Namibia and South Africa, are definitely going to be some some regions that would have a lot of projects coming on stream in the next couple of years. Dangote is also recently, again moving out of Nigeria, but still talking about Dangote, announced an investment of I think 2.6 billion in Ethiopia for energy storage, and those are like really useful beyond them just making headlines for investments being made, but I think they're actually very impactful projects that are coming on stream in the next couple of years that people should really be looking forward to. I think the key phrase for me is that any project that is coming on stream is coming with patient capital. The guy that approached Musa and wished for a Dangote wished for another Dangote from South Africa, I think what he really just was saying is that he hopes that they can get patient capital. So I think that's really the key word for me when it comes to all the projects that are coming on stream. But yeah, there are quite a number of projects that are tilting towards improved production, and even from where I sit, from corporate, we are doing a couple of drilling programs that will see increased production, particularly in Angola. But yeah, I'll pass it on to Gospel to give some more light on that.
I mean, really, really brilliant submissions there, honestly. I mean, it's almost covered everything I was going to say, technically. But yeah, I think the future of the continent is really bright, really, really bright. We just need to probably tell our stories better. I think the continent still requires, more investments, to be able to unlock not just growth, because I mean it holds the most promising growth aside China. I think about 4%, thereabouts on the average by IMF, compared to other regions in the world. So it's something promising happening there, really. But again, the investments have to be met with clear economic outcomes, or outcomes, particularly for particularly in key economic sectors, sectors that could, that can create jobs and all the likes, and for key economic stakeholders like MSMEs and the likes. Just trying to bring a different angle to this now. And you've got a lot of development finance institutions who are really doing some very heavyweight investments in the sector, in the market. I mean, BII is doing a very huge work there. The Climate Investment Fund is doing a lot of work in Africa. The Rockefeller Foundation as well, the Shell Foundation. So lots of development finance institutions are now also looking at Africa, and the models through which they're financing many of these initiatives are also changing. Aside from just being grant-led, they're also looking at some blended finance options as well. And there's also lots of catalytic fund options also going into the region. But the conversation here is that the region itself has to be positioned to not just take on those investments, but also tell its stories better. Tell the stories better. Show what it's doing to the world. Come off with a stronger comparative or competitive edge. In many of its negotiations. So for instance, there's the London Climate Action Week is almost wrapping up, and a major government stakeholder was talking about how we now have solar-led street lights, this kind of stuff. You get what I mean? So we're talking very, I think that is really underselling the potential of what sort of climate investments you need within that vibrant city, in Africa, to be able to unlock growth, at another level. It's beyond just street lights. Anybody can think of that, really. But in terms of powering the sectors that will create the jobs, supporting MSMEs, solar farms, grids, and all those kind of interesting, investments. I think those are the kind of conversations that we need to start having, and also spotlighting our work in such a way that it's attracting the right investors to the table.
Thank you for that, especially your conversation in terms of the job creation. But I just want to touch on that a bit more, that a lot of the time people argue that some of these projects don't lead to jobs being created, especially in the societies and villages in which these refineries are created. And also the impact on the environment is also key. You're producing so much crude oil, you're changing a lot of this crude oil into refined products. Obviously, it creates a lot of carbon dioxide and impacts the climate. So how do we basically resolve this, and how do we move in which we're creating jobs, but at the same time taking account of the environment?
It's interesting we're talking about this now, and we're just talking about the sort of capital that's flowing through the region, because I was privileged to be part of a financing discussion recently where the financer really wanted to see a clear path to emission reduction. And so I think, first of all, the financiers are making a big push to force the government and force anybody doing any of these projects to make sure that they're doing it more responsibly and not destroying the environment where these projects are coming on stream. So that is good news on that side. So, that just says whether they want it or not, they kind of have to, right? But from a job creation perspective, I think it comes in multiple folds. The governments have also demanded in a lot of these projects that certain roles are filled locally, and that's the way that governments have stepped in to ensure that the job creation is not done externally but actually helps the community. I think those are sort of two initiatives that I've seen help to drive the job creation from just conceptualization to actual actualization, and make sure that the environment doesn't get destroyed while creating value for the broader audience, right? It's always good to look at the bigger picture, but you can't ignore the people that are around all of these projects, right?
Mm-hmm. Gospel, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, the job market in Africa is largely informal than formal, and the framework or mechanism around through which young people arrive at fulfilled or dignified work is largely informal than formal. So even though you have lots of conditions that come around to say, okay, reserve a certain quota of your whatever, for local people and all that, there are big conditions around capacity, big conditions around skill, but most importantly, bigger conditions around access to the market opportunities to start with. So I think Africa still needs to, get a lot of work done around how we create the jobs, how young people are actually, by the way, you have a lot of young people who are also upskilling, but there are no market opportunities for those jobs. So the context for innovation, the market itself is not growing or expanding at the level of innovation where it's able also to take on new skill sets within the ecosystem and get young people gainfully, employed or engaged and all of that. So I think it's more or less a demand and supply side conversation, and how the bits around the oil and gas investments within the region are enabling that. To a large extent, I think government needs to work very closely with more private sector leaders, more young people, more community stakeholders to really understand the job dynamics and how these investments trickle down to the last mile.
Sure, and it'll be very interesting to see if that happens in the future, the trickling down of potential jobs. But Musa, let's pass it on finally to you one more time. So once again, going back to those trends and projects that you find fairly fascinating, and where you think the future holds for these trends and projects in Africa.
Yeah. So the Angola, of course, I think the only project that I didn't hear mentioned was a project that's also happening like in Uganda. It's not that big. It's 60,000 barrels in Hoima Refinery. But I think the future for Africa is slightly bright, right? And I'm saying that very intentionally because we're now starting to see private players willing to put skin in the game. You are sensing global capital looking for projects in Africa that are most likely, like find these private players. So I think it's kind of like a destiny defining moment we're entering right now. Just, a few things about the jobs market. I think I actually did the math one time, because if you combine like the big companies in Nigeria currently, so aside Dangote Refinery, but they just employ about 10,000 Nigerians. Like in the grand scheme of things, that is very, very little. And as already discussed, I think we just need to think very, very profoundly about the kind of context we're in. I think original thinking is necessary to be able to solve the jobs issue, to solve productivity, because I don't think, even these refineries will solve a tenth of the problems that are in the job market. I think that is another conversation entirely. And even with the government inefficiencies, the truth is that we still can't do it without the government. So the government is a necessary evil, I would say, in this case, right? So how do you make the government, create the environment, create the incentives necessary, first of all, for all of these projects to thrive, but then secondly, is for the kind of people needed on these projects to be from the continent as well. I don't know if you see the management team in Dangote, they are mostly Indians, they're not Nigerians, so that's another factor. If it's not there, the government will practically change some things to fix the issue.
And that's all for the Afribond Roundtable. A massive thank you to Gospel, Oluropo, and Musa. If you did like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be back for a conversation on agriculture in Africa. But until then, take care.